On today's episode, Christian leadership lessons from the life of Winston Churchill with guest Wallace Henley. Welcome to the Christianity in Business podcast, an initiative of the Archie W. Dunham College of Business at Houston Baptist University. I'm your host, Darren Shear, and this is a show that helps Christian business leaders to integrate biblical values into business. You can get more information about HBU's Center for Christianity in Business, including the Christian Business Review academic journal, articles, videos, and news about upcoming events by visiting our website at christianityinbusiness.com. And now, on to today's interview. Today, we're going to be discussing Christian leadership lessons from the life of Winston Churchill. And we're joined by Wallace Henley, co-author of the new book, God and Churchill: How the Great Leader's Sense of Divine Destiny Changed His Troubled World and Offers Hope for Ours. And this is a book that he co-authored with the great-grandson of Winston Churchill, Jonathan Sandys. Wallace is senior associate pastor of Houston's Second Baptist Church and is also the author of Globequake. And his insight and wisdom have come through a career of more than 40 years that's included service in the church, the White House, the U.S. Congress, and academia. Welcome to the Christianity in Business podcast, Wallace.
Thank you, Darren. It's a real pleasure to join you.
Well, it's an honor to have you. Well, as soon as I started reading your book, God and Churchill, I was reminded of a couple of books that my dad gave to me as a young Christian, which actually wasn't too long ago, but I was just starting in the Air Force. I was in the ROTC program, and he gave me the books The Light and the Glory and From Sea to Shining Sea by Peter Marshall and David Manuel. And so, of course, these are spiritual biographies of Christians who weren't necessarily pastors of churches, although there were many, church leaders like Charles Finney and Asbury and others, but it reminded me of those books and the way that they just inspired me to view these culture shaping leaders such as Winston Churchill and to see them and how God was at work in their lives. People that we don't often think about the spiritual life of Winston Churchill. We know that he used a lot of biblical references and rhetoric in his speeches and so forth, but what you've done in this book, it's just an outstanding book, is help us to see how God was at work in his personal life and how, of course, that ultimately shaped history. So if you would tell us, as we jump into this interview, a bit more about yourself and what led you to write this book?
Well, first of all, I've read both of those books that you mentioned by Peter Marshall, and they're tremendous books. And the spiritual history of individuals is extremely important. That's really what the story is all about. I started out professionally as a journalist. I was working for the Birmingham News in Alabama in the mid to late 60s when the civil rights, Dr. Martin Luther King, the civil rights reformation there was really, really going strong, and covered a lot of that, had direct interaction with it. And then in 1970, I was invited to come to the White House to work on, interestingly enough, the school desegregation, and went on from there to work on general domestic policy and political liaison in the White House. And I became fascinated in those years with the dynamics of power. And I realized that corporate power, whether it's in the church, an educational institution, or a company, small company, big company, mega big company, the dynamics of power and authority are extremely important to recognize and to understand. And I became fascinated. I was born December the 5th, 1941, which was 2 days before Pearl Harbor. So I grew up in the immediacy of World War II and especially the aftermath of World War II. And I would hear this raspy voice on the radio, and I would go to what we called in those days the picture show, and they would show black and white newsreels, and this bald-headed man that looked like an infant was on there with that raspy voice named Winston Churchill. And I became fascinated with this man. And later, while I was in the White House, I went to England for the first time in 1971 to meet with a group of other leaders from other nations. And as I was walking around, I think I'm about 30 years old at that point. I'm walking around. I'm looking at the monuments. I'm looking through the iron fence at Buckingham Palace, and I'm hearing down deep inside, there's more here than meets the eye. There's more here than meets the eye. And again, that just intensified my interest to try to understand Churchill. I went down in the war rooms. I went down in all kinds of places. We chart where he lived. It just made a lot of pilgrimages that just reinforced that. Finally, I started calling my home study the Churchill room. Mm-hmm. And then in 2014, the great-grandson of Churchill, who lives here in Houston now, asked me to meet with him, and he said, I want you to help me write a book, God in Churchill.
Wow, and that sounds like another chapter of the providence of God in the life of Churchill.
It's the providence of God. And if we yield to that, and if we see that and understand that, life is extremely exciting. You never know what God is going to open next.
Right. Wow. Well, there's a statement that, and Churchill spoke of the need to preserve and to build a Christian civilization. What did he mean by that?
Well, first of all,
that's sort of that would be kind of an inflammatory phrase to use today. I mean, if as a politician gets up and says that we want to preserve and establish and build a Christian civilization under my administration, I don't know how many extra votes he would get.
Well, every culture, every nation functions around a consensus, and the consensus of Western society in general. In the 1940s and 50s, I really was nurtured in that, was that we are a Christian society as opposed to non-Christian societies. So Churchill said, first of all, he said the highest level of ethics is found in the Sermon on the Mount. And secondly, he understood that his mission was to be the counterfoil to the anti-civilization which was represented in Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, that was opposed to everything in Christian civilization. And thirdly, Churchill said there is a certain way of life that is associated with this worldview and this civilization. He said, for example, the banks, and he talked in very practical terms. He said the banks in our civilization would not dare close and keep out their investors and their savers and their depositors without some kind of action that would mitigate that on that the impact on those individuals. Whereas a totalitarian society would manipulate and control everything, including the financial security of people. He said we would never deny people the right to trial by jury. You're innocent until proven guilty. And he said all of these things are part of what makes up a Christian civilization. So he was very practical in his understanding.
Sure. So as we kind of really focus in on the Christian business leaders who are listening to this podcast, what would you say would have been one of Churchill's biggest mistakes that these business leaders need to learn from as we seek to honor God through our businesses?
Well, running a nation is very much like running any kind of large corporation. You're dealing with institutional issues continually. And there were several mistakes that he made. His greatest mistake that history remembers is his mistake in the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles, a passage from Turkey down into the Marmara and Aegean seas, and a very narrow passageway. And it was very important to the interest of the British and the Allies in World War I to have that passageway open. And so Churchill entered into an agreement whereby that would be opened. It resulted in the deaths of about 500,000 men, soldiers, and Churchill largely was blamed for it. Now, we explain in our book that he probably was not the sole one to be blamed, but he took most of the responsibility, because sometimes Churchill could be adventurous And he could sometimes, especially in his early career, and this was way back in 1914, actually it was in 1911 when he became the First Lord of the Admiralty, and then it's during the war, 1914 to 18, that this mistake is made. But that adventurism would get him into trouble several times. It got him into trouble with his political party when he would move across the aisle. It got him into trouble with his dealings when he was Home Secretary with the Irish. So I would say the biggest mistake that Churchill made had to do with his adventurism, which was a passion to be edgy and to try the extremes and push the limits without giving careful consideration to the cost of that. Now, obviously, he learned a lot from that, and that helped shape him as a leader.
Wow. Well, that's certainly a lesson that we all need to heed. And because there are many ways where especially leaders are visionaries often and can easily start to make rash decisions based on maybe a feeling and not truly weigh the potential consequences and make sure that we seek the necessary counsel before we make those decisions. Is that kind of what I hear you saying?
Yes, exactly. And this was all part, he said when he became Prime Minister on May the 10th, 1940, all of my past life had been a preparation for this moment. And when he came into the Prime Minister's role, those lessons about adventurism and other issues had been learned early on, and he took them very seriously, and the lessons equipped him to give the leadership he gave during the Second World War.
Well, his life certainly is an adventure. I mean, just reading about his prison escape, and I felt like I was watching Steve McQueen, escaping out of prison. Just the stories that, as I read the book, I was like, I've never heard this about Winston Churchill. Yet another reason to go and pick up this book, God and Churchill. What would you say? So that's sort of on from a negative perspective. But what would you say is one of Churchill's best qualities that Christian business leaders should seek to emulate as marketplace leaders?
Most business leaders, and I've been a consultant to businesses and corporations, different kinds of institutions, and what I discover over and over again is that most business leaders don't give proper heed to the development of corporate culture. And so the first issue, and one of the most successful things that Churchill did, the first issue he faced, 1938, 1939, then in 1940 when he becomes Prime Minister, is to create a new culture in Britain. The official establishment in Britain, 1938-39, thought that surely Britain would go down, that Britain would not be able to stand against the Nazis. So in a business environment, let's talk about the competition. There was the mentality within this corporate thing called Great Britain that we cannot beat our competition. And so Churchill had to turn that around. In fact, the king actually preferred another British leader for Prime Minister, but this British leader did not want to be Prime Minister because he said, I don't want to be the one who turns over the keys to London to the Nazis. And so they turned to Churchill. So Churchill has to create a new environment. And that new environment was expressed in his earliest speeches when he talked about the sacrifice that was to come, but always creating in the minds of the people, we can beat this. We can beat this competitor. We can win. He was realistic on the one hand. He was very visionary on the other hand with his predictions of victory. And he created a cultural environment, a corporate cultural environment in Great Britain that rallied the people.
Wow. Well, one of the things that I think Churchill, at least from my perspective, is known for is somebody that was very tough and somebody that just would not back down. And yet he still had to deal with a lot of internal conflict. And obviously the business leaders who are listening to this podcast episode today, probably maybe even today, are dealing with some very difficult conflicts in their workplace. How did he handle internal conflict, and what can we learn from that?
Let's compare the British War Cabinet to a corporate board. Every CEO and certainly every chairman has to understand the dynamics of dealing with a board of directors. Churchill had to deal with a war cabinet. Under the constraints of that time, he had to rally the people, so he had to bring in every facet of British political life into that war cabinet. It had to be a cabinet that represented all of the positions of the people and all the positions of the political parties. So it was a very diverse group of people, just as in a board of directors. In fact, there might be a little more unity in a board of directors because everybody is focused on that particular corporate entity, but not everybody will have the same vision of how to accomplish the strategic plan. So Churchill had to bring everybody into harmony in this very strange arrangement of individuals. I mean, Chamberlain, whom he replaced as prime minister, was still on that panel. And one of the great marks of Churchill was that he would not, as tough as he was, he would always, his first priority was always to win over and to build bridges between those people with whom he differed. He learned that in his early life when he made some of those mistakes. But he built bridges because his goal was to get everybody to focus on the same vision. There would be differences of opinion on mission and on strategy, but he would unify them around that vision. He would give them a very distinct role to play in the achievement of that vision. He would applaud them when they played a very significant role in helping that come about, and he would speak honestly with them when they were not. But always it was based on these relationships and friendships.
Wow, powerful insights. I'm curious, Wallace, on a personal level, as we're wrapping it down here, on a very personal level, what was one of the most important things or the most surprising things that you learned during the process of researching and co-authoring this book?
I would say it was the way Winston Churchill treasured Elizabeth Everest. Churchill's parents were typical aristocrats. They were Downton Abbey on steroids. They put him out when he was just a kid. They sent him away to school to get him out of their hair. His father was a derelict. Although he was high in politics, he was nevertheless a derelict, a sexual predator, and all kinds of things, you might call him. And his mother also had numerous affairs, although he loved his parents very much, and he really respected his father's political career. But nevertheless, they sent him off to school. And by the grace of God, this is a Romans 8:28, God works all things together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. By the grace of God, the person who formed his early life was Elizabeth Everest, his nanny. And she was a very deeply committed Christian who loved the Bible, loved the Word of God, who just infused that child with the King James Bible. The impact was so powerful that when he died at 90 years of age, her picture was still on his bed table. So I would say that the thing that surprised me was the impact, and this was probably the most powerful woman of modern times, because she was the one who put that heart in Winston Churchill.
Wow. And this was, Everest, she was not a high church person, right? From what I remember you writing was that she was, just very down to earth, and just very meek. What would you say to kind of describe the kind of person that she was?
She was a very humble person. She was a very non-self-focused individual, and that low church mentality or worldview was what poured into Churchill to become a man of the people. Churchill was a descendant of Marlborough. Churchill was a descendant of the aristocracy, and yet Churchill was very much a man of the people. He saw himself as an average guy, even though he was very much above average. But he had the capacity to speak to the people in the lowest levels, and they called him Winnie, and they loved it, and they marched with him. And I think a lot of that came from Elizabeth Everest.
Wow. So many incredible insights in this book. Wallace, where can people get the book and where can they learn more about you?
Well, the book is available all over the place. It's on Amazon. It's on ChristianBooks.com. It's on Barnes & Noble. It's in bookstores everywhere. And there's a website, www.godandchurchill.com, www.godandchurchill.com. And to learn more about me, they can look at WallaceHenley.com, www.WallaceHenley.com.
Beautiful. Well, we'll have those links in the show notes for this episode. Wallace, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise and your research and your passion with us today. Keep doing great things for God in the marketplace and through your ministry.
My very great pleasure. God bless you, buddy.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if so, we would greatly appreciate it if you'd leave us a quick rating and review for the Christianity and Business podcast on iTunes. You can get more information about HBU's Center for Christianity and Business at christianityandbusiness.com. Thanks for listening, and keep integrating biblical values into your business.